Meera Patel's flower shop was a haven of beauty and sophistication. Located in one of the wealthiest districts, it boasted high ceilings, large glass windows that let in natural light, and shelves lined with fresh flowers meticulously arranged like pieces of art. Each bouquet told a story, and Meera took pride in crafting them herself. To her, flowers were not just decorations, they were emotions wrapped in petals. The shop catered to the city's elite. Wealthy clients strolled in for extravagant arrangements, whether for weddings, grand openings, or anniversary celebrations. Despite this demanding clientele, Meera remained grounded. She found joy in her craft, though she often questioned the sincerity of the high society world that surrounded her. Among her regular customers, James Carter stood out. A successful businessman, James had the kind of presence that demanded attention without effort. Tall and impeccably dressed, his movements were measured and deliberate, like someone who was used to being in control. His choice of car, a sleek black Jaguar, matched his aura of sophistication. Yet it wasn't James's polished exterior that intrigued Meera. It was his routine. Every Saturday at 10 a.m. sharp, he entered the shop, greeted her with a polite nod, and headed straight to the roses. After carefully selecting 3 of the reddest, most perfect roses, he paid and left without lingering. He never deviated from this ritual, and he never bought anything else. Meera couldn't help but notice him. As someone who believed flowers carried meaning, she often speculated about his story. Was he buying the roses for someone he loved, or were they for a client? The possibilities played in her mind, but James gave no clues. His demeanor was always calm, almost distant, yet there was an unspoken weight in his eyes that hinted at something deeper. For months, she observed him quietly, her curiosity growing with every visit. Though she was used to the habits of her high-profile customers, James's steadfast ritual struck her as both fascinating and puzzling. It was a quiet Saturday morning when Meera finally decided to break the silence. James had just entered the shop, as punctual as ever, and made his way to the roses. Meera, standing behind the counter, watched as he carefully selected 3 perfect red blooms. She couldn't suppress her curiosity any longer. As James approached to pay, Meera spoke up, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "May I ask, why do you always choose 3 red roses? Is it for someone special?" James paused, his hand resting lightly on the counter as he looked at her for a moment. His usually composed face softened slightly, and a faint, bittersweet smile appeared. "They're for someone who'll never see them," he replied simply. The response hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Meera felt a pang of something she couldn't quite place. Sympathy, intrigue, perhaps even admiration for the quiet strength he seemed to carry. She hesitated, unsure whether to press further, but something in James's demeanor made her decide against it. Instead, she nodded politely and handed him his change. "Thank you," he said with a polite nod, then turned and left, the roses in hand. That night, Meera found herself replaying the brief interaction in her mind. His words echoed in her thoughts, stirring questions she couldn't ignore. Who was this man really? And what kind of loss could lead to such a ritual? Meera had always been pragmatic. She didn't believe in fairy tale love or grand romantic gestures, but something about James's quiet devotion to this mysterious ritual intrigued her. It wasn't just the roses. It was the weight of his words, the sadness in his eyes, and the unshakable precision of his routine. The question lingered with her for days, sparking an internal conflict. Part of her wanted to dig deeper, to understand the man behind the polished exterior, but another part warned her to keep her distance. After all, they lived in 2 entirely different worlds. He, the successful businessman, and she, the hard-working florist. Still, Meera couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James than met the eye. The following Saturday, James arrived as usual. Meera, now more aware of his presence, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He followed the same routine, stepping in precisely at 10 a.m., choosing 3 red roses, and approaching the counter. This time, however, Mira decided to lighten the mood. As she wrapped the roses, she looked up with a faint smile. 3 roses again, you must really like them. James's lips curved into a small smile, less distant than before. I suppose I do, he replied. They're timeless. The simplicity of his answer left Mira wondering once more about the deeper meaning behind his words. Still, she didn't push further, sensing that he wasn't ready to reveal more. Over the next few weeks, something began to change. James started lingering in the shop for a little longer. At first, it was subtle. A glance at the other flowers, a few extra seconds spent admiring the arrangements. Then, he began asking casual questions. These tulips are beautiful. Do they grow well in colder climates? Or, how long do orchids usually last? Though the questions seemed incidental, Mira suspected they were his way of prolonging their interactions. She didn't mind. In fact, she found herself looking forward to his visits, her initial curiosity gradually giving way to genuine interest. One Saturday, as James placed the roses on the counter, Mira couldn't resist asking again. Her voice was softer this time, less playful, but more sincere. I hope you don't mind me asking, who are these roses for? James looked at her, his blue eyes meeting hers with a depth that caught her off guard. For a moment, he said nothing, as if weighing whether to share the truth. Then, he spoke. They were for my wife, he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. She passed away 2 years ago. Red roses were her favorite, and every Saturday I'd bring her 3. It was our little tradition. Mira felt her heart tighten at his words. She had imagined countless scenarios, but nothing quite like this. James continued, his gaze now fixed on the roses. Even though she's gone, I couldn't stop. It's my way of keeping her memory alive. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mira, unsure of what to say, simply finished wrapping the roses and handed them to him with a quiet, understanding nod. I'm sorry for your loss, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. James thanked her and left, but the exchange lingered with Mira long after he was gone. That night, as she closed the shop, she found herself thinking about James. Not just his story, but the man behind it. Beneath his polished exterior and composed demeanor was someone grappling with profound loss, holding on to a ritual that brought both comfort and pain. In the days that followed, Mira began to see James in a new light. He wasn't just a businessman or a customer. He was someone who had loved deeply and was learning, in his own way, how to navigate life without the person who meant the most to him. James, too, seemed to notice the shift in their interactions. The next Saturday, as he picked up his usual roses, he lingered a little longer by the counter. Mira, sensing his hesitation, smiled and said, "Let me know if you ever feel like switching to daisies. They have a charm of their own." To her surprise, James chuckled softly. "Daisies are nice," he replied, "but they don't have the same impact." For the first time, there was a lightness in his voice, a glimpse of someone willing to let go of the weight he carried, if only for a moment. The following Saturday felt different. Mira noticed it the moment James stepped into the shop. His usual impeccable demeanor seemed slightly more relaxed. His tie was a little loose, and there was a faint weariness in his expression. As he approached the counter with his 3 roses, Mira couldn't help but ask softly, "Is everything all right today?" James looked at her, the faintest shadow of a smile on his lips. "It's just one of those days," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "Some days, the memories feel heavier." Mira hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. Then, as if speaking more to herself than to him, she said, "Sometimes it helps to share those memories with someone else." James held her gaze for a moment, his eyes revealing a mixture of surprise and gratitude. After paying for the roses, he lingered by the counter, uncharacteristically hesitant. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "I hope this isn't too forward, but would you like to grab a coffee after your shift?" Mira blinked, caught off guard. For a second, Doubts flashed through her mind. They came from completely different worlds. What could a florist and a businessman possibly have in common? But something in James's voice, a quiet vulnerability, made her push those doubts aside. "Sure," she replied with a small smile. "Why not?" Later that afternoon, they met at a small cafe a few blocks away. It was a cozy, unpretentious place, a stark contrast to the high-end world James seemed to belong to. Seated across from each other, Mira finally got a glimpse of the man behind the polished exterior. "I've told you about my wife," James began, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of him. "What I didn't tell you is how much losing her changed me. It wasn't just her I lost. It felt like I lost myself, too. Everything in my life, it just turned gray." Mira listened quietly, her heart aching at the raw honesty in his words. For the first time, James allowed himself to be vulnerable, and Mira realized just how deeply he had been hurting. Taking a deep breath, James looked up and said, "But talking to you, it's been different. Somehow, it feels like I can finally start to breathe again." The cafe became their new meeting spot. Every Saturday after James's visit to Mira's flower shop, they would sit across from each other, sipping coffee and sharing pieces of their lives. These moments, once unimaginable to Mira, slowly became something she looked forward to. For James, the weekly conversations were a lifeline. In Mira, he found someone who didn't demand perfection or expect him to maintain the polished image he showed the rest of the world. She listened without judgment, offering quiet understanding instead of advice. One afternoon, after a few weeks of these meetings, James opened up further. "You know," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "when my wife passed, I thought that was it. The world kept moving, but for me, it just stopped. Those roses were my way of keeping her close, even when she wasn't here anymore." Mira nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think it's beautiful," she said softly, "the way you honor her memory. But I also think she'd want you to find color in your life again." James looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that made her heart skip. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, for the first time, he smiled. Not a polite, restrained smile, but a genuine one that reached his eyes. The shift in their dynamic was subtle but undeniable. James began spending more time at the flower shop, not just on Saturdays but occasionally during the week. Mira noticed the way his demeanor lightened around her, the quiet laughter that began to replace his reserved politeness. One afternoon, as Mira was arranging a new display of tulips, she caught James standing by the counter, holding a small bouquet of daisies. She raised an eyebrow playfully. "Daisies, huh? Switching things up?" James chuckled, a low, warm sound that made Mira smile. "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe I just wanted to surprise you." The light-hearted exchange felt natural, almost effortless. It was as if they had known each other far longer than a few months. Mira, who had always been skeptical of love, found herself reconsidering what she thought she knew. Despite their growing connection, there were still moments of hesitation. Mira couldn't help but wonder if their worlds were simply too different. She had built her life around her flower shop, finding joy in simplicity and hard work. James, on the other hand, came from a world of wealth and sophistication, one that felt as distant to her as the stars. But James saw things differently. One evening, as they were walking back from the cafe, he stopped suddenly. "Mira," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "you've done something for me that I didn't think was possible. You've made me feel alive again." Mira looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. "James, I'm just me. I don't have anything extraordinary to offer." He shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're wrong. You've given me something more valuable than anything money can buy. You've reminded me that life can still have meaning, even after everything I've lost." For the first time, Mira allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, their connection wasn't as impossible as she had feared. One Saturday morning, James didn't appear at Mira's shop. His absence was unexpected, and Mira couldn't ignore the worry that crept into her thoughts. He had always been punctual, his visits as constant as the ticking of a clock. When another week passed without a sign of him, Mira decided to do something she had never imagined she would. She remembered James mentioning the cemetery where his wife was buried and found herself drawn there, compelled by a mixture of concern and curiosity. The cemetery was cloaked in a stillness that seemed almost sacred, the faint rustle of leaves the only sound breaking the silence. As Mira walked along the rows of weathered headstones, her eyes caught sight of James, standing motionless in the distance, his figure silhouetted against the soft gray of the morning light. He stood in front of a grave, holding 3 red roses. His posture was composed, but there was a softness in his stance that Mira hadn't seen before, a kind of peace she couldn't quite place. When he noticed her approaching, he wasn't surprised. Instead, he offered her a gentle smile. "I had a feeling you might come," he said, his voice calm. Mira stopped a few feet away, unsure if she was intruding. "I didn't see you at the shop," she said quietly. I was worried." James nodded, his gaze returning to the grave. "Today is different," he explained. "It's the anniversary of her passing, and it's the last time I'll bring these roses here." Mira frowned slightly, confused by his words. "What do you mean?" James took a deep breath, his expression thoughtful. "I've been holding on to the past for so long, Mira. These roses were my way of keeping her memory alive. But I've realized that holding on like this, it's kept me from moving forward." He placed the roses gently on the grave as if saying a final goodbye. "She was a beautiful part of my life, but I know now that it's time to let her rest." Turning to Mira, his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "You've shown me that life doesn't have to stop after loss, that there's still hope, and maybe even love, waiting to be found." In that moment, Mira felt the depth of his words, the courage it took for him to let go of the past. After placing the roses on the grave, James took a moment, his gaze lingering on the headstone before turning to Mira. His voice was calm but carried a hint of something new. "Hope." "Let's get out of here," he said, extending his hand with a gentle smile. "There's somewhere I'd like to take you." Mira hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. Together, they walked in silence, leaving the cemetery behind. To her surprise, James brought her to the same cozy cafe where they had shared their first coffee. The familiar warmth of the space wrapped around them as they found a quiet table near the window. Seated across from each other, James looked at Mira with an intensity that made her heart flutter. There was no hesitation in his expression, only a quiet determination. "For 2 years," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I've been trapped in the past. Bringing those roses, holding on to her memory, it was my way of coping. But I've realized something." Mira stayed silent, her gaze fixed on him, waiting for his next words. "She was an incredible part of my life," James continued, "but holding on to the past has kept me from living in the present. And then you came along. Without even realizing it, you've changed everything. Every conversation, every smile, every little joke, it brought color back into my life. You reminded me that there's more to living than just existing." Mira's chest tightened, her thoughts racing with doubt. "James," she said softly, hesitating as she searched for the right words. "I'm just a florist. How could someone like me possibly matter so much to you?" James smiled, his expression warm and sincere. "You're not just anything, Mira. You've given me hope. You've shown me that it's okay to let go, to embrace the future." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I want to move forward, Mira, and I want to do it with you." Mira's mind raced with doubts about their different worlds, their contrasting lives, but something in James's voice silenced those fears. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. With a small smile, she replied, "Maybe we could take it one step at a time." James chuckled, relief and joy evident in his expression. One step at a time sounds perfect. As they left the cafe together, the weight of their pasts seemed lighter. What had begun as an unassuming weekly ritual, a man buying 3 red roses, had grown into something neither of them could have anticipated. Life has a way of surprising us, even in the most mundane routines. For Mira and James, it was a flower shop, a quiet ritual, and a shared vulnerability that brought them together. Their story was proof that sometimes love blooms in the most unexpected places when we least expect it. As they stepped into the fading light of the afternoon, their steps seemed lighter, their hearts carrying the quiet promise of a new beginning. It wouldn't be perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it would be real. A connection built not on fleeting moments, but on understanding, hope, and the courage to move forward together.